Lenin's final years. Vladimir Lenin was the founding leader of the Soviet Union. By 1922, he was 51 years old and at the height of his political power. That year, everything changed. In May of 1922, Lenin suffered his first stroke. He survived, but the damage was visible. His speech became impaired. His movement on his right side was affected. Doctors were brought in from Germany to assess him. He was ordered to reduce his workload, but he continued to push through official duties where he could. In December of 1922, a second stroke followed. This one was more severe. Lenin was relocated to his estate at Gorky, outside Moscow, where he could be monitored. His ability to speak deteriorated further. His written output, which had been enormous throughout his career, slowed dramatically. He dictated notes where possible, but his physical capacity to govern was gone. In March of 1923, a third stroke removed what remained. Lenin lost the ability to speak entirely. He could no longer write. He could no longer participate in the political process he had built. He remained at Gorky under medical supervision, largely immobile, for the months that followed. On January 21st, 1924, Lenin died at the Gorky estate. He was 53 years old. The official cause of death was recorded as a cerebral arterial sclerosis leading to a final stroke. What followed his death was unusual. Rather than a standard burial, the Soviet government made the decision to preserve his body and place it on permanent public display in a purpose-built mausoleum on Red Square in Moscow. The decision was controversial even within the Soviet leadership at the time, but it was carried out. His body remains there to this day. Dictator found on floor. Joseph Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union for nearly 3 decades. By 1953, he was 74 years old and still in power. He ruled from his private dacha at Kuntsevo, outside Moscow, surrounded by guards and staff who answered to him completely. On the night of March 1st, 1953, Stalin did not emerge from his private quarters as expected. This was unusual. The guards stationed outside his rooms were aware of it, but no one moved. Entering Stalin's personal space without being summoned was not something his staff did. The consequences of disturbing him without cause had historically been severe. So, they waited. Hours passed. It was not until the early hours of March 2nd that a staff member finally entered the room. Stalin was found on the floor. He was alive but unresponsive and could not speak. He had apparently been lying there for several hours before anyone came to him. Medical personnel were called, but even the doctors who arrived were visibly afraid. Treating Stalin carried its own risks. Physicians who delivered bad news to Soviet leadership had not always fared well. The doctors assessed him and confirmed he had suffered a brain hemorrhage. Stalin was moved to a sofa. Medical staff worked to stabilize him over the following days. Senior Soviet officials visited. His condition did not improve. He remained largely unresponsive as the days passed. On March 5th, 1953, Joseph Stalin died. The official cause was recorded as a cerebral hemorrhage. The hours he spent on the floor before anyone entered the room were noted by historians as a direct consequence of the environment of fear he had spent decades constructing. No one had dared to check on him. That delay was never officially examined. Secret police chief's end. Lavrenti Beria was the head of the Soviet secret police, known as the NKVD. He was one of the most powerful men in the Soviet Union and widely considered the most feared. For years, he had operated as Stalin's chief enforcer, overseeing arrests, interrogations, and the machinery of state repression. When Stalin died on March 5th, 1953, Beria moved quickly to consolidate power. He made alliances, repositioned loyalists, and presented himself as a potential successor. The other senior Soviet officials watched him closely. Several of them, including Nikita Khrushchev and Georgy Malenkov, concluded that Beria was too dangerous to leave in place. On June 26, 1953, Beria was arrested during a meeting of the Soviet Presidium. The arrest was carried out by military officers brought in specifically for the purpose. Beria was taken into custody before he had any opportunity to respond through the security apparatus he controlled. His allies within the secret police were removed from their positions in the same operation. He was held in a secure military facility while the Soviet leadership prepared its case against him. The charges included treason, terrorism, and a range of other accusations. The trial was conducted in secret over a single day in December of 1953. No public proceedings were held. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. Beria was found guilty and sentenced to death. On December 23, 1953, Lavrenti Beria was game overed by shooting in a bunker in Moscow. The execution was carried out by Soviet General Pavel Batitsky. He was 54 years old. The man who had overseen the deaths of countless others through the Soviet system was processed by that same system in the end. Removed leader, dies quietly. Nikita Khrushchev had led the Soviet Union through some of its most turbulent years, including the Cuban Missile Crisis and the early space race. By 1964, he had been in power for over a decade. Then, in October of that year, his colleagues moved against him. While Khrushchev was on holiday at a Black Sea resort, the Soviet Presidium convened in Moscow without him. When he returned, he was confronted by the assembled leadership and formally removed from all positions. No trial, no public announcement of wrongdoing. He was simply told his services were no longer required. Leonid Brezhnev took his place. Khrushchev was allowed to live, which was notable given the fate of others who had fallen from Soviet power before him. He was assigned a small dacha outside Moscow and a modest apartment in the city. He was given a pension. He was also placed under surveillance and effectively cut off from public life. Former colleagues did not visit. He was not invited to state events. His name largely disappeared from official Soviet discourse. He spent his remaining years in this enforced obscurity. He tended a garden. He worked on memoirs that were eventually smuggled out and published in the West, which caused embarrassment to the Soviet leadership, but no formal punishment for him. On September 11, 1971, Nikita Khrushchev died of a heart attack at his home. He was 77 years old. The Soviet government did not grant him a state funeral. He was not buried at the Kremlin Wall alongside other senior Soviet figures. Instead, he was buried at Novo-Devichi Cemetery in Moscow. The contrast between the scale of his former power and the quiet circumstances of his death and burial was not lost on observers at the time. Leaders, public decline. Leonid Brezhnev led the Soviet Union from 1964 until his death. By the late 1970s, he had been in power for over a decade and was one of the most recognizable political figures in the world. He was also visibly unwell. From around 1976 onward, Brezhnev's physical deterioration became apparent to anyone watching Soviet state television. His speech was slurred during public addresses. His movements were slow and labored. At official ceremonies, he struggled to read prepared remarks. Foreign dignitaries who met with him during this period later described a man who was present in name, but diminished in every observable way. Reports emerged of his dependence on sedatives and other prescription medications, a detail that became widely discussed in Western intelligence assessments of the time. The Soviet government continued to present him as a functioning leader. State media showed him attending events, signing documents, receiving delegations. But the gap between the image being projected and what was visible on screen became increasingly difficult to reconcile. His speech at the 1980 Moscow Olympics opening ceremony drew particular attention internationally, with observers openly questioning his condition. He continued in the role regardless. No formal transition of power was initiated. The Soviet system had no established mechanism for removing an incapacitated leader, and those around him had no incentive to force the issue. On November 10, 1982, Leonid Brezhnev died. He was 75 years old. The official cause was cardiac arrest. He had been the public face of Soviet power for 18 years. In his final years, that decline had played out in front of cameras, at podiums, and in meeting rooms across the world, visible to everyone and formally acknowledged by no one. Governing from a hospital. Yuri Andropov became leader of the Soviet Union in November of 1982, succeeding Brezhnev days after his death. Andropov was 68 years old when he took power. He had previously led the KGB for 15 years and was considered a sharp, disciplined figure within Soviet leadership circles. What was not publicly known at the time was that he was already seriously ill. Andropov had been suffering from kidney disease for some time before he came to power. Within months of taking office, his condition worsened to the point where he required regular dialysis to survive. The Soviet government did not disclose this to the public. Official state media continued to present him as a functioning general secretary. Photographs were released. Statements were issued under his name. The machinery of Soviet public messaging operated as though nothing was wrong. In reality, Andropov spent much of his time as leader in a medical facility. During his final months in power, he governed almost entirely from a hospital bed at a clinic outside Moscow. He met with select officials there. Documents were brought to him. Decisions were relayed through intermediaries. The extent of his condition was concealed from the Soviet population and from most foreign governments throughout this period. He had been in power for 15 months in total. On February 9, 1984, Yuri Andropov died. He was 69 years old. The official cause was kidney failure. When the Soviet government finally disclosed the nature of his illness following his death, it confirmed what Western intelligence services had been attempting to determine for months. He had been leading a superpower while tethered to medical equipment, in a hospital room, with the full knowledge of only a handful of people around him. 3 leaders, 28 months. Konstantin Chernenko was selected as leader of the Soviet Union in February of 1984, days after Andropov's death. He was 72 years old. He had emphysema, a chronic lung condition that affects breathing capacity, and his health had been a known concern within Soviet leadership circles even before he was chosen. He should not have been a serious candidate. But the Soviet system at that moment had few alternatives that the senior leadership could agree on, and Chernenko had the right political connections. He was given the role despite his condition. From the beginning, his physical limitations were observable to anyone watching his public appearances. He breathed with visible difficulty. At podiums, he read speeches slowly, pausing in places where the effort of speaking was apparent. Foreign officials who met with him during this period noted his labored breathing in their accounts. He moved carefully. His appearances were kept brief where possible. The Soviet government managed his public image as it had done with Brezhnev and Andropov before him, but the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore internationally. 3 consecutive Soviet leaders were visibly unwell. Western observers began openly discussing the gerontocracy at the top of Soviet power, a leadership structure so resistant to change that it was selecting dying men to run the country. Chernenko held the position for 13 months. On March 10, 1985, Konstantin Chernenko died. He was 73 years old. The official cause was heart failure, compounded by emphysema and liver cirrhosis. Brezhnev had died in November of 1982, Andropov in February of 1984. Chernenko in March of 1985. 3 leaders of the world's second largest nuclear power had died within 28 months of each other. Last Soviet leader dies. Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union in March of 1985, chosen in part because he was young and healthy at 54 years old. He was the last general secretary the Soviet Union would ever have. He introduced reforms that loosened state control over information and political expression. Those reforms accelerated forces the Soviet system could not contain. By December of 1991, the Soviet Union had formally dissolved. Gorbachev resigned as its president on December 25th of that year, delivering a brief televised address and signing the documents that ended the country he had led. He was 60 years old when it ended. He then lived for another 30 years. In the decades that followed, Gorbachev remained in Moscow. He gave interviews, wrote books, and occasionally commented on Russian political developments. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990 for his role in ending the Cold War. Within Russia, his reputation was considerably more divided. Many Russians held him responsible for the collapse of Soviet power and the economic instability that followed in the 1990s. He was never prosecuted, never exiled, and never stripped of his pension or his foundation. His wife, Raisa, died of leukemia in 1999. In his later years, Gorbachev's own health declined. He suffered from a prolonged illness in his final years, though his office did not publicly specify the exact nature of his condition. On August 30th, 2022, Mikhail Gorbachev died in Moscow at a central clinical hospital. He was 91 years old. The cause was listed as a serious and prolonged illness. No further detail was officially released. He had outlived the country he led by 30 years and 7 months.